Right now, underneath the concrete you walk on every single day, there is a city. It has highways, nurseries, climate control, waste management, farming operations, and a workforce numbering in the tens of thousands. It has existed in some form for longer than your house has stood on that lot, and in a few documented cases, colonies of the same ant species have been traced back decades, quietly running underneath patios, driveways, and porches without a single homeowner knowing. Most people's first reaction, the moment they spot a few ants marching along a patio slab, is to walk to the garage, grab a can of spray, and try to wipe the whole thing out in an afternoon, but that decision can backfire in ways almost nobody expects. In some cases, killing part of a colony doesn't destroy it, it multiplies it. In other cases, the chemicals you seep exactly where you didn't want them to go. And in almost every case, people are declaring war on an organism that statistically has been doing them a quiet favor for years. Let's start with what's actually down there because the mental image most people have is wrong. A mature ant colony is not a single nest of ants living in a hole, it's what biologists call a superorganism, a term used because the colony behaves less like a group of individual animals and more like a single living body made of thousands of interchangeable cells. No single ant decides anything, the queen doesn't give orders, instead the colony operates through chemical signaling, pheromone trails, contact cues, and shared food passed mouth to mouth that let tens of thousands of workers behave as one coordinated system. Patios, sidewalks, and driveways are, from an ant's point of view, prime real estate, because the slab acts like a solar panel, absorbing heat during the day and radiating it slowly at night, keeping the soil underneath warmer and more stable than open garden soil, which speeds up brood development, and the concrete also acts as a roof, keeping rain from flooding the tunnels and predators from digging in from above. In most temperate climates across North America, the species doing this is the pavement ant, small, dark brown to black, and so common that pest control operators consider it one of the most frequently reported nuisance ants in the country. And you've probably seen their handiwork without knowing it in the small mounds of loose soil, pushed up through cracks in a sidewalk, or the seam where a patio meets the house, which is excavated tunnel material brought to the surface one grain at a time. Other common patio residents include odorous house ants, named for the rotten coconut smell they release when crushed, along with various field ants and thief ants depending on the region. And underneath a patio, you're rarely looking at just one nest, since mature colonies routinely have multiple entrances scattered across a wide area, all connected by tunnels running several feet underground, radiating outward from chambers where the queen or queens are kept safe from surface disturbance. Temperature swings and predators. A single mature pavement ant colony can contain anywhere from a few thousand to over 10,000 workers, and some species maintain multiple egg-laying queens in a single nest rather than just one, which means the ants you see on the surface represent a small fraction, often less than 10% of the total workforce, the rest being underground foraging, tending larvae, or expanding the nest. So before even talking about whether to remove a colony, it's worth sitting with the actual scale of what's being discussed, because this isn't a few ants, it's an established, multi-chambered, multi-generational underground settlement that has likely been there far longer than the problem became visible to you. Here's where the story gets genuinely counterintuitive, because in most yards that colony is quietly providing services that would otherwise cost you money, time, or a healthier lawn. As ants dig their tunnel networks, they loosen compacted soil and create channels that let air, water, and plant roots penetrate deeper than they otherwise could, functionally similar to what earthworms do. And in dry or hard-packed regions, ants are considered one of the primary soil engineers doing this job, arguably rivaling earthworms in some ecosystems, which means better aeration and rainwater soaking in instead of pooling and running off, reducing erosion around your patio's foundation rather than causing it. Ants are also relentless scavengers, collecting dead insects, crumbs, and organic debris and hauling it back to the nest, where waste and leftover food decompose inside the tunnel system, releasing nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium directly into the surrounding soil, nutrients your grass and garden beds used to grow. And some agricultural field studies have found that soil inhabited by ant colonies carries meaningfully higher nutrient content than ant-free soil nearby. With one widely cited experiment finding ants and termites together increased wheat yield by roughly a third through improved water infiltration and soil nitrogen, purely from tunneling activity. Many common ant species are also aggressively territorial and predatory toward other insects, competing with preying on and displacing other pests, including some termite species, simply by controlling the surrounding territory, which means homeowners who eliminate an established, non-destructive ant colony sometimes find months later that a different and more damaging pest has moved into the vacated territory because nothing was there anymore to compete with it. And certain ant species also carry seeds back to their nests for the fatty appendage attached to them, discarding the seed itself intact in the nutrient-rich soil near the nest, effectively planting it, with several thousand plant species worldwide estimated to rely on ants for this kind of dispersal. None of this means every ant is harmless or that you should never intervene, but it does mean the reflexive assumption that ants under the patio equals a problem that must be solved by force skips over the fact that, ecologically, that colony is often functioning as unpaid landscaping staff. This is the part that changes how most people think about the spray can. Several common ant species. When a colony comes under sudden environmental stress such as flooding, physical disturbance, or a surface insecticide treatment that kills workers near an entrance but doesn't reach the deeper chambers, respond with a survival behavior pest control professionals call budding, where a queen or a group of workers carrying eggs and larvae splits off from the main nest and relocates to a new site nearby, meaning instead of one colony you can end up with 2, 3, or more satellite colonies spread across a wider area of your yard, each one now harder to locate than the single nest you started with. Which is a well-documented reason certain surface treatments actually make an infestation worse rather than better, since you disturbed the superorganism without killing its reproductive core and it responded by expanding. On top of that, you're often only ever treating the surface, because nest chambers for mature colonies routinely sit multiple feet below grade, insulated by the very slab you're trying to protect, and a liquid or aerosol treatment poured or sprayed at a visible entry point kills the ants unlucky enough to be near the surface at that moment but rarely penetrates deep enough to reach the queen chamber, which is precisely the part of the colony that determines whether it survives. Meaning colonies that appear to disappear for a few weeks after a surface treatment frequently rebound once the workforce regenerates from an untouched queen. What goes under the patio also doesn't stay under the patio, because broad-spectrum insecticides poured into cracks and gaps around a foundation slab don't stop at the ant tunnels. They follow the same water pathways the colony itself is using, meaning runoff can move toward garden beds, lawn areas, storm drains, and over time local waterways depending on your soil type and drainage, and ants aren't the only organisms using that soil. So broad chemical treatments applied repeatedly around a foundation can affect earthworms, pollinators foraging nearby, and beneficial soil microbes that have nothing to do with the ant problem you were trying to solve. There's also a structural irony worth knowing, because people instinctively worry that ants under a patio will undermine the slab, when in reality the tunnel networks of most common backyard ant species are fine, narrow, and don't meaningfully compromise a properly poured concrete slab's structural integrity, unless the species involved is a carpenter ant colonizing wood framing rather than soil, which is a different situation entirely. While repeated pesticide application directly into foundation gaps and expansion joints, especially liquid formulations, can over years contribute to material degradation of the joint sealant far more than the ants ever would. To understand why just killing it fails so often, it helps to understand ant biology a little more deeply, because a queen ant in many common species can live for years, in some documented cases over a decade, and during that time she is functionally the only reproductive engine of the entire colony, while workers typically live weeks to a few months, creating a strange asymmetry where you can kill thousands of visible worker ants and functionally accomplish nothing. Because the colony's ability to recover depends entirely on whether the queen, tucked away in the deepest, most protected chamber of the nest, survives. Colonies also communicate almost entirely through chemistry, so when workers are killed near an entrance, survivors can detect the chemical signature of the disturbance and root foraging trails around it, effectively adapting in real time, which is part of why the same treatment applied twice in the same spot often produces diminishing results, since the colony has already adjusted its behavior. And then there's scale, since estimates for the total ant population on Earth run into the tens of quadrillions, with some biologists putting the number as high as 20 quadrillion individual ants alive at any given time, meaning ants may outweigh, by some estimates, the combined biomass of all wild birds and mammals on the planet. So a single backyard is a rounding error in that picture, worth remembering the next time an afternoon is spent trying to eliminate a colony through brute force. Because from the ants' perspective, and from the ecosystems, the war being declared is against one of the most successful, most deeply embedded life forms in the environment you live in. None of this is meant to make the situation feel hopeless. It's meant to explain why the tools most people reach for first, a spray can and a Saturday afternoon, are mismatched to the actual biology of what they're fighting. Now, the honest and important caveat, because this isn't about letting every insect problem run wild. There are specific situations where fast, professional intervention is genuinely warranted, and telling them apart from an ordinary pavement ant nest matters. Carpenter ants don't nest primarily in soil. They excavate galleries in wood, often moisture-damaged wood in deck framing, porch supports, or areas where a patio structure meets your house, So if you're seeing large black or bicolored ants, noticeably bigger than typical pavement ants, along with fine sawdust-like material called frass near wooden structural elements, that's a structural concern worth having a professional inspect. Because the damage accumulates in load-bearing wood rather than in soil that doesn't bear weight, fire ants, common across the southern United States and parts of the Southwest, build visible above ground mounds and deliver a painful, sometimes medically serious sting, particularly to children, pets, or anyone with an allergy. And their aggressive defense behavior and public health risk make them a legitimate case for prompt, targeted treatment rather than passive coexistence. Colonies actively entering the house, appearing in kitchens, bathrooms, or around food storage in large, persistent numbers, are a different problem from a colony that stays outside under the slab. And at that point, you're dealing with a hygiene and nuisance issue indoors, not simply an outdoor ecosystem contributor, so targeted indoor treatment or professional consultation is reasonable. The throughline across all three exceptions is the same. Act when there's a genuine risk to structure, health, or safety, not simply because ants exist and are visible. So if blanket chemical warfare is often counterproductive, what's the actual move for an ordinary, non-structural, non-fire ant colony living under your patio? Start by identifying before you act, since a 5-minute comparison of the ants you're seeing, their size, color, whether they're coming from soil versus wood, whether there's an above-ground mound, tells you almost everything about which scenario you're actually in. And this single step prevents the vast majority of unnecessary interventions. Default to coexistence for ordinary soil nesting species, because if it's a pavement ant or odorous house ant colony that stays outdoors, isn't entering your home in numbers, and isn't damaging anything, the ecologically and financially cheapest option is simply leaving it alone, since you are not required to have a bug-free backyard and the colony is on balance, likely doing more soil and pest control work for you than it is costing you. If action is needed, use targeted rather than broadcast methods. Because targeted bait stations that worker ants carry back into the colony are far more effective than surface sprays, working with the colony's own foraging and food-sharing behavior instead of against it, reaching the queen indirectly through the same network that makes the colony a superorganism in the first place, which avoids both the budding problem and the runoff problem. Manage the moisture and food sources that attract ants to the house itself rather than the yard, by sealing entry points at the house's foundation, fixing sources of excess moisture, and keeping food sources contained, which addresses the part of the problem that actually matters to you, ants inside your living space, without requiring the destruction of an established outdoor colony that was never bothering you to begin with. And when in doubt, call a licensed professional rather than a DIY chemical approach, particularly for suspected carpenter ants or fire ants, since professional pest control has access to targeted treatments, correct species identification, and application methods designed to avoid both the budding response and unnecessary chemicals spread into surrounding soil and waterways. Here's the reframe worth carrying out of all this. The ant colony under your patio isn't automatically an infestation, and in the majority of ordinary backyard cases it's a multi-thousand-member underground operation that's been quietly aerating your soil, recycling nutrients back into your yard, and competing against worse pests for free, for years without you noticing. And the instinct to eliminate it in one aggressive afternoon usually collides with the actual biology of the colony, a protected queen, a chemically coordinated workforce. And a well-documented tendency to split and spread rather than simply die when disturbed the wrong way. Understanding that doesn't mean tolerating every ant problem, since carpenter ants in your deck framing and fire ants in your yard are real legitimate reasons to act quickly. But for the ordinary colony living quietly under the slab, the smartest move is usually the one nobody expects: leave it, or treat it with precision instead of force.